It's something we all want and all deserve. And central to health is food. Not just enough food, but enough good food. Sadly, cruelly, unfairly, many don't get enough. Not enough food, and not enough good food. Here's a few depressing statistics from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is a branch of the United Nations. As of 2018, I'll just read it here, some 820 million people around the world are undernourished. That's about 10.8% of the world population. And it's actually getting worse. After many years of steady improvement, since 2015, the rates have flattened out and even begun to rise. And since COVID-19, the situation has almost certainly gotten quite a bit worse. At the same time, many hundreds of millions are overnourished. And it's often the same people. I mean, consider that undernourishment in sub-Saharan Africa, again, I'm reading statistics here, is overall around 23%, while the prevalence of obesity is 25%, or even more in some areas of sub-Saharan Africa. Nutrition experts call this the double burden of malnutrition. Healthy, nutrient-dense foods are becoming increasingly hard for the poor to obtain, as they become increasingly displaced from their ability to provide for themselves and become increasingly reliant on cheap and largely empty calories from the industrial food economy. You can buy chips almost anywhere today. And that's a form of hunger too. Hunger for good food. But many hundreds of millions can't even afford chips. And their problem is simply undernourishment. Why? Is it because there isn't enough good food to go around? Is it because there are too many people in the world, that the planet is too small? Thomas Malthus, a British economist from a couple of centuries ago, said, yep, that's the basic problem. Because of sexual desire, population grows exponentially until, bang, it hits environmental limits. That law of our nature, which makes food necessary to the life of man, implies a strong and constantly operating check on population from the difficulty of subsistence. This difficulty must fall somewhere and must necessarily be severely felt by a large portion of mankind. The result, said Malthus, was misery and vice. The basic logic, if you can call it that, of Malthus's argument is that population growth causes poverty. And at the time, the British Parliament was considering what they called the Poor Laws, a series of measures to provide relief for the poor. Malthus claimed that these laws are pointless because population will expand until hunger sets in anyway, due to environmental constraints.
Lord Richard Head here, Baron of Hot Ayrshire. You can call me Sir Dick. Sir Dick Head, that is. The poor will always be with us. Nothing can be done, really. It's terrible, but there it is.
Versions of Malthus's argument continue today in many forms, what they call Malthusianism. Malthusians today are not necessarily heartless like Malthus. Perhaps some are, but many Malthusians are just scared. They're scared by the way our population has grown 8-fold since Malthus's time. and by how it looks set to grow tenfold to 10 billion people by 2050, and probably even more, through to perhaps 11 billion in 2100. Many people argue that we are just eating up the world. You can't eat your planet and have it too. Other Malthusians go a step further. They point to how most population growth is taking place outside the wealthy countries. Hunger, poverty, and high population growth are all associated, they say, proving Malthus was basically right in their view, that population growth causes hunger and misery. That's a step too far, say critics of Malthus. And there have long been very vigorous critiques of Malthus, what is called anti-Malthusianism. There are three basic critiques: the inequality critique, the technologic critique, and the demographic critique. And there is assuredly a lot to complain about in Malthus's arguments. You can't deny his basic point. The world is only so big. But let's not be misled by that crude point, say anti-Malthusians. Let's not be environmental determinists. The anti-Malthusians sometimes overstate their positions too, however. So let's have a look and try to tread a way through both crude Malthusianism and crude anti-Malthusianism. Let's take up the inequality critique first. That's the one I find most persuasive. Now, one of the first points inequality critics raise is that Malthusians are basically being racist, whether intentionally or not. They seem to fear a rising horde of more colorful folks from the global poor of the global south. Malthusians often seem to place the responsibility for population increases on the poor, blaming the victims, the poor, for their troubles. This is just Malthus and his concern about vice among the poor all over again, say inequality critics. And it completely neglects the far greater per capita environmental impact of folks from the global north. A second point that inequality critics raise is that we need to understand the political and economic origins of global poverty. The poor countries of the world were until very recently almost all colonies of the European powers. As recently as 1950, not long ago in historical terms, every country in Africa except three, Egypt and Ethiopia and Liberia, were colonial possessions of the European powers. And the colonial powers, they set up mines and factories and farms, and they took home most of the profits. Only Egypt, Ethiopia, and Liberia enjoyed political independence, and even they were heavily controlled by less direct means. Those less direct means have greatly expanded. The era of colonialism may be over, but in its place came Neo-Colonialism, by which the rich countries still largely control the economies of poor countries. And as a result, the money continues to flow out of the poor countries, despite efforts at, and some critics say in part because of efforts at, international development, which is a pretty challenging point, and I'll take that up in more detail in a later lecture.
Bosh! The Empire was just trying to civilize them. They were lucky we cared enough to try.
Plus, argue inequality critics, there is plenty of food to go around even with our current population levels. In 2019, the farms of the world produced 347.9 kilograms of grain per capita, which is about 2.1 pounds per day. those 2.1 pounds translate into 3,334 calories per day, which is well above the recommended calorie intake of about 1,600 to 3,000 calories a day, depending on your age, sex, and activity level. Plus, a lot of those calories of grain go into industrial meat production, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. The takeaway for now is we actually have plenty of food to feed people. Yet nearly 1 billion suffer hunger. Why? Because they are poor and disenfranchised, say the inequality critics. Not because of population levels. In fact, the reason why the poor often have big families is because more kids is an economic survival strategy that increases their pool of household labor. Malthus had the causality exactly backwards, say the inequality critics. It's not population growth that causes poverty and hunger. Rather, it is poverty and hunger that leads to population growth. Let's turn quickly to the technologic critique of Malthusianism. Now, this perspective basically says, hey, have you noticed that population growth keeps going up? There hasn't been a Malthusian crash yet. And why not? Because whenever things get rough, we have an incentive to come up with a technological solution. Take Norman Borlaug's Green Revolution, for example. Technology will always save the day. Right? And what that technology does is allow us to substitute one resource that might be running in short supply with another. Substitutability is the technical term for this, and yeah, they aren't making any more land, so bring on the synthetic fertilizer, bring on the pesticides and the new genetics. That substitutes for the land crunch.
All you need is grit and determination. And a kick in the butt from the market. That will save the world. Always has. Always will.
And finally, let's consider the demographic critique. Now, the basic argument here is that population growth solves itself. Because modern technology is what led to population growth in the first place, by reducing death rates. Now, eventually, culture catches up, and parents realize that their kids are dying young, and so they have fewer kids. That's what happened in the global north, and eventually that will happen in the global south, say the proponents of the theory of demographic transition, as it's called.
Give people more cars and more servants. Then they'll want fewer kids, I always say.
But there's some issues with all these critiques. The demographic critique neglects that the population transition to smaller families that happened in the global north depended upon modernization bought, in part, with wealth extracted from the poor countries. Who are the poor countries going to extract from? The technologic critique misses that some resources are actually pretty hard to substitute for. They aren't making any more rain or sunshine either. Plus, technological innovation is really pretty hard, especially in conditions of extreme inequality. The world's poor rarely get to go to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, for example. Finally, the inequality critique sometimes seems to forget that poverty is in part environmental poverty. The poor are generally relegated to the environmental margins of the world. The best farmland typically costs the most money. The environment is part of inequality, and we can recognize the importance of environmental constraints without being environmental determinists who are seeking to dodge human, social, and political responsibility. Nonetheless, the inequality critics are right that inequality is the main cause of hunger. So maybe we can best put it this way: that the problem is not just that there are too many people, but there are too many people with too little, and too many people with too much. But together, in a fairer world, we can lift everyone up.